Michael Brecker uses the chromatic approach notes right here, adding one half step below the target note. Train the chromatic approach notes by playing this exercise. I'm basically just running up the scales in thirds, adding a chromatic approach note to every third. When you play a jazz bass, you add a chromatic approach note below and before the target note you're going to hit. In this example, it's below the E and below the C. When I'm thinking chromatic approach notes, I'm actually thinking bebop. Barry Harris would talk about this chromatic approach notes, but he just called it,
oh, I got to do more than that. I got to put a half step between the F sharp and the A flat, and then put a half step in between the A flat and the A.
Adding a half step. But the use of the half step have developed much, and so many players like Michael Brecker have taken it so much further than beyond bebop. I'll get back to this Michael Brecker lick later in the video. Let's get into how we can train and how we can apply chromatic approach notes into your playing. I just mentioned before that this is how to train the chromatic approach note. This exercise takes you through all the chromatic approach notes in the diatonic scale. And yes, there are so many other chromatic approach note exercises. I'll get into many of these through the video. The basic chromatic approach note is a leading tone below and before the target note you are going to hit. And in this video, this is the only chromatic approach note I will work with because there are so much material to learn just with this one note. We can play chromatic approach notes to all the diatonic notes in the scale. And you really want to go all in on this because you want to be flexible, being able to apply chromatic approach note to all the notes. I recommend you to play the exercise slow in the beginning, really learn what chromatic approach notes hits what notes, and then later speed up. The next step after this is adding a small phrase, and it's really simple. Any phrase can do. And here it's really important that you start thinking about what chords are you playing or what chord functions are you playing. I have added a little part of the scale and then at the end adding a chromatic approach note. And this makes me able to play this pattern through the whole scale. When I'm composing these kinds of small licks, I'm always thinking about what chords do they fit, what function fits on this phrase. Let's expand and compose a few phrases using the chromatic approach note. In this way you get a really good feel on how you can use the chromatic approach note. I start out with a chromatic approach note on that D minor chord. My target note is the C, so I'm playing the B, a half step under the C. Late in the D minor 7 bar, I play the C sharp into the D. On the G7, I lead into the 7th of that G7 from the E to the F. And on the C major chord, I lead into the E using a D sharp chromatic approach note. And please do not limit yourself on thinking only one kind of line is possible when you're using chromatic approach notes. Since you can add a half step below any note in any scale in any chord, you can play any line added a half step in front of it. Let's look at this arpeggio. When you have any nice line, like this arpeggio for example, you can add a half step to it. I'm going down that arpeggio and adding the half step below from the C sharp to the D going up that scale. In this example, I'm reusing the D minor arpeggio. I'm adding a half step to that F later in the bar. Another example is when I'm starting with the half step to that C, and then I'm adding a half step to that A, both on the D minor chord. When you look at the end of this line, you can see I'm adding a half step to that arpeggio going up. That's an E minor arpeggio, adding the D sharp half step. Playing the chromatic approach note from under an arpeggio is a really common jazz phrase everybody uses and it sounds great. You might want to train this in the scale. The half step before the arpeggio is relatively easy to use. My basic line is that D minor chord adding that C sharp in front of it. This C sharp is the major 7 on that D minor chord. I'm actually playing a chromatic approach note, the C to the C sharp. And then the C sharp is a chromatic approach note to that D, coming a little bit later in the sentence. Later in the phrase on the C major chord, I'm adding an E minor 7 chord as the upper structure. Before the E minor 7, I'm adding a D sharp as a chromatic approach note. And remember that arpeggio exercise with the chromatic approach notes to it also has all the upper structures of all the diatonic chords. And really use this when you compose your licks. I'm first using the F major on that D minor 7 chord, and later I'm having the B half diminished on that G7 chord. This shows you a little bit about how you can use the chromatic approach note on all the phrases you can think of. But of course you need your good taste to judge. might have noticed that I'm quite fond of the chromatic approach note leading into descending arpeggios. I think the chromatic approach note can take a line that's good, and when you add the chromatic approach note, it becomes remarkably good. The chromatic approach note gives you this extra outside kind of feeling. Remember when you train the arpeggios up with the chromatic approach note, train them going down, adding a chromatic approach note. In this leg, I'll start in the middle, playing the D minor arpeggio going down, playing the B chromatic approach note into that C on that D minor 7 chord. When you are anyways going to use descending arpeggios, add chromatic approach notes to them. Another little arpeggio is the triad. When we're talking about descending arpeggios, try using the triads. When you add a chromatic approach note to the 5th and they are descending, it sounds really great. Of course, you must first train the patterns in the scale. These are triads added a chromatic approach note to the 5th in the diatonic scale. And again, you see I add the chord names to every triad I'm playing. When I train technical exercise, I already want to have a good idea on where I can apply this into my music. One of the things I really like about the chromatic approach note to the triad is the usability. The pattern has exactly 4 8 notes and it's 2 beats long, which makes the application of the pattern so easy into almost any context. Like here in the G7 chord where I'm playing the D minor and the C major triad, both with a chromatic approach note to the 5th. It's an easy pattern to apply. It's also really resourceful. I'm using the pattern chromatically descending, playing that D flat triad into that C major chord, where the D flat triad is acting as a tritone substituted dominant going into that C major chord. When you, for example, get into substitution chords like the tritone substituted dominant, you really need to play your chromatic approach note patterns in more keys. This makes the application so much easier. Another great substitution chord where you can use these triads are the backdoor dominant, or towards applying these patterns into more scales in more keys, making it much easier to add substitution chords into your vocabulary. Learn to use this in more keys, get many exercises and extra licks. Download the fully loaded lesson manual on Patreon, the link is in the description. Still need to go through this option which I played earlier, adding chromatic approach note to the scale. What I mentioned earlier, you could basically apply the chromatic approach note to any line you want. But you must know the harmonic function you want to express. And this is a great example on how confusing the harmonic functions of the chromatic note can be. In this line I'm basically making a little turn on the chromatic note, but you can also see it as a little part of the scale with the chromatic approach note. Then I'm playing a little bebop scale, but that's a chromatic approach note too. And then I'm adding a chromatic approach note to that A, going down that G7 chord. So you judge on this, what is the chromatic approach note, what's a turn, what's a bebop scale? And here you see why the chromatic approach note to the scale going down doesn't really work. The chromatic approach note to a scale going down is more like a turn. We are running into the same problem when we're using chromatic approach notes into this scale line descending. Chromatic approach note to a descending line basically sounds like a turn or changing the direction, and not as the intended chromatic approach note. That's what I think. If you have a different opinion on this, please mention it in the comments. But look at the beginning of this line. This is a great success. Using the chromatic approach note to an ascending line on that D minor chord, and on the second half of that G7 chord using that G sharp to the A, great success, and later the B to the C on that arpeggio down, works. This gets me thinking, is it a chromatic approach note or is it something else? Please check out all the exercises and all the extra licks in the lesson manual. Everything is in 12 keys to get you a great start. Link is in the description. If you like these chromatic lines, you must check out this video. This is Charlie Parker, John Coltrane and Michael Brecker on how they interpret chromatics. I strongly recommend you to run through this video right away. Play music, have fun.